So this morning I'd like you to turn to Isaiah 28. We're going to start in the 11th verse. Isaiah writes 28 through the 13th. It says, "For with stammering lips and other tongues," or let's start at the 9th. "Who will he teach knowledge? And whom will he make to understand the message? Those just weaned from the milk? Those just drawn from the breast? For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. For with stammering lips and other tongues he will speak to this people, to whom he said, This is the rest with which you may cause the weary to rest, and this is the refreshing. Yet they would not hear. But the word of the Lord was to them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little, that they might go and fall backward and be broken and snared and caught." And if I were to title my message, it would be Trust the Process. You know, there's a process that God has. Now, in the computer world, in fact, in business world, and just about everything there's a process. And the process says you start at point A and you go to point B and then you go to point C and you keep working your way around till you get to the end. You can't run around and come in at point P and go to the end because you're missing something at point A. It's like in a lot of teachings or a lot of trainings or education at school. You know, people say, well, I already know how to use a camera. I don't want to have to go through all the process. Just tell me what here. And the thing is that the process starts you at the camera. And they teach you the manual processes. Oh, we don't need the manual processes. These cameras nowadays think for themselves and focus and do everything. But it's just like this morning. My iPad went down. If I trusted solely into that, I'd be up here going, but I know how to use one of these. There's a process, and it's there for a purpose. And this process takes us and it moves us along a path. And this path brings us down to the end where we want to be. The thing that we desire to be in our Christian walk, it brings us down here. But when I was thinking about this process, I thought of a very interesting happening. We had a young man in the church in Pennsylvania, and you remember the commercials that said, "Get your cars painted by Maaco." $84 I think is what it was, or $85. Get your whole car painted at Maaco. You don't hear those commercials anymore. And probably, I don't even know if Maaco is still in business or not. But he took his little car, it was a gold car, and had a lot of rust on it, and took it to Maaco. Well, Maaco, what they do is they just give it a real quick sand and put paint on. They don't care how nicely the tape and the windows are taped off and the chrome is taped off. They just sand it. They put a little tape for protection, and they paint it. Oh, it came out, and he was so excited about his car, and it was painted white. What do you think about it? I looked around it, and they must not have taped it too well. You got paint on your chrome, and that's unusual. Well, it was only $84. And then you looked where the rust used to be, and the rust was still there, just had a coat of paint on it. And the bubble in the paint was still there and it had a coat of paint on it. There was a process that they should have done to make the car right, and the process was fix the rust. But for $84, we're not going to get that. Tape it off properly, but for $84, we're not going to get that. And then paint it, and who knows, I mean, they'd have probably made a little bit of a profit off of it if they'd have just taken a paintbrush and a roller and put latex paint on it and shoved it out the door. But the whole point is there's a process. And so many times we just like to whitewash the gospel over what we've got and say it's done. About a year later, the rust started bleeding through the paint. Pretty soon, you know, the scales were falling out and the rust was back. Because it was never dealt with. They just put a coat over it. And it's a process. That's why I say you can't go down here to the middle of the line and jump in and finish the process, because there's things that you need to be done all the way back here. And this process brings us through. And it brings us, and as you build on the process, you know, it's like when I do the brakes. There's certain things I have to do. The tire has to come off. You have to take the bolts out. When you clean everything up, when you put it back together, well, you have to push the piston back into the caliper. And there's a process. If I don't push the piston back in the caliper, it's not going to go on. And I'm going to say this thing's defective and go spend however much money a caliper is to buy a new one. When all the process is, push the caliper back. Takes a C-clamp and you put it in there and you just, or you get one of those fancy tools. They cost 35 bucks. I bought one. And you put it in there and you crank it in, and it was made. I had one that the piston had to twist as it goes in, and you had to have a special tool to do that or you would ruin the piston. But there's all a process. And if you try to skip around and choose and pick the processes you like, then what happens is you have problems. A good example of this, Donna and I bought a diesel Oldsmobile. It was a good car. But then what happened was we had a problem and it needed a new head gasket. Believe it or not, I'm in Pennsylvania. There's no head gaskets anywhere. And the only place that there's a head gasket is in Columbus, Ohio. So I had it shipped from here to there. I picked up my head gasket and I was talking to this man. He says, I'm going to tell you something right now. He says, a diesel engine's not like a car. If you don't replace the bearings on the bottom, you'll get about 5,000 miles out of it, and then you're going to have to replace the bearings and a lot of other things. But at the time, I didn't have the money to replace the bearings. And I replaced the head gasket. The head gasket put more stress on other things. And almost 5,000 miles to the mile, the bearings went out. And there I sat on the coldest night of the year on the side of the road just across the bridge on 2nd Street. I don't know whether I called Donna or Brother Manival, and they came down and got me. We sold the car to Mr. Han, and they pulled the diesel engine out and put a gas engine in. And we went out and bought another car. But the process is, there's a process that you have to follow. And if you don't follow the process, then what happens is you get down the road and there's a problem. And so Isaiah said, here's the process. The process is a precept upon precept, precept on precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. Now, if you don't follow the process is going to take you the other direction. For every action, there's a complete reaction, or equal and opposite reaction. Okay, so here's the deal. He says if you don't do this, Then there's going to be line up or precept upon precept, line upon line, and everything else until you fall backwards and are destroyed. Or snared and caught is actually what it says. You'll be broken, snared, and caught. So what happens is the process, you either follow the process and you come into what God is wanting for you, or you don't follow the process and you go the opposite direction. And the problem is so many times people decide to whitewash. They used to call it whitewashing a barn. It really wasn't painting. They took the paint and watered it down really good and just kind of put a coat of white on. A good rain would come by and the paint would be gone. Because it was a whitewash. It really wasn't painted. And a lot of people were swindled out of a lot of money because they thought that they were getting a paint job, and actually what they got was just a little bit of a thing that made the thing look good. And so the process is this, is that the process gives us the Word of God. And the Word of God takes us through a process. Just like planting a plant, like doing anything in life, there's a process, and the process says, this is how we do it. This is where we go. This is how we do. And if you bypass a step, I don't know how many times I've sat down and written scripts and written SQL code, and I'd miss a step, or I'd put a comma in the wrong place, or I'd put and all of a sudden the code would run until it got to that point, and then it would stop. Now, years ago, they didn't have all the fancy tools we got now that'll take us to the spot where it was. You had to kind of go down through and go, okay. And you remember years ago they had what was called the BAT file. You know, we didn't have Windows, and you sit down there and you wrote the BAT file so that you could sit down and put WP and it would open up WordPerfect. But there was a BAT, there was a file. And if you didn't write it correctly, it wouldn't do a thing. Nothing happened. There's a process. And so Isaiah is speaking here to the people, and he said, here's the thing. Whom do we teach knowledge? Who do we make understand the message? He said, for precept is on precept. There's not a one of us in here. I don't care how good we are at math or good we are at any certain thing. There's not a one of us that didn't have to learn 2 plus 2. You know, we could kind of pass the 2 plus 2 and the 1 plus 3 and the 3 minus 1 and the so on and so forth, and we just jumped right into the multiplication and division of long numbers. Remember, they used to call it, you had the simple division, then you had the long division. We all had that process. We didn't come out of the womb running. We were carried, then we learned to walk. We took our first step and fell over and landed on our backside. There was a process. And the same process works in this area. In our own lives, God takes us through a process. He says, okay, Keith, this is what we're going to work on this week. And you go, okay. And at the end of the week, when you get the test and you flub and fail miserably, I'll give you a perfect example. Mrs. Trineri was my 6th grade teacher in Linden Elementary on Cleveland and 3C, right there on the point. I was a lousy speller. I was telling Donna this the other day coming home. And if it hadn't have been for spell check on computers, I'd probably still be a lousy speller, because on spell check I would spell it and then it would spell it correctly, and I'm going, oh, okay. But if you failed the test, then you had to go home and you had to sit down and write each spelling word 17 times a night. So that was your homework. So that when you took the spelling test on Friday, you'd know how to spell them. Well, me and my, shortcutitis. That would be a good word for it. I designed a pencil that had 3 leads on it, and I could write it and write the word 3 times, writing it once. But the interesting is doing that when Friday came, I could spell the words because of the process. Now, I didn't write them 17 times. I negated a part of the process. But the point is the process was if I did this over here, I would be able to spell this. And that was the process. And if I would pass the test, well, then the next week I didn't have to write the words again. But then if the next week I didn't pass the test, I'd have to write the words again. It becomes a process. And God says, we're going to take you through a process, and this is what we're going to do. And we're going to deal, first of all, with attitudes. Or sin, failure, anything you want to put in there that can't be covered over by the grace of God. Or let me rephrase it. Can't be whitewashed. It's like the rust on a car. You got to deal with the rust on the car. I got a rust spot out there on the car, and I could take it to somebody and just say, have a coat of paint put on it, but I'm going to tell you what, in a few months the rust would come back. And the rust is still there. And it still is a weak part in the body. And so here it is. He says, I'm going to do this. And he says, okay, this week we're going to work on this. And I flub miserably at the end of the week. And he goes, guess what we're going to work on next week? What did the Bible say? The Bible said the Israelites went around and around and around Mount Sinai. They just kept going around the mountain. Finally God says, okay, we're going to walk you through the wilderness for 40 years. And hopefully when we get ready to go into the promised land, we've got people that know how to do it. They got into the promised land and still were utter failures like their parents. Although they did conquer a few things and they did do a few things, they still had some issues. And so what happens is, he says again, this process is going to take you from here to here. But understand something, in that process, we're going to deal with these things and we're going to carry you on. In John, the 5th chapter, I don't remember quite how I had these verses in order, so they may be out of order compared to what I there you go, a different message. And we're going to start in the 12th verse and read to the 16th verse. It says, then they asked him, who is the man who says to you, take up your bed and walk? But the one who has healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, and a multitude being in that place. Afterwards Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. The man departed and told the Jews it was Jesus who had made him well. For this reason the Jews persecuted and sought to kill him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath. Ooh, the Sabbath. But he says here, see, you have been made well. You have passed the course. You have passed this step. See that you don't go backwards. Paul writes, he says, how can we live in sin if we're dead to sin? But we go backwards. We take the process and we go forward in the process. So we go, here's A, and we get to B. Well, we don't like B. We liked A better, so we decide to go back. And Jesus looked at this man and he said, listen, he said, you can't go from this place back to this place without having an adverse effect. If you do, the effects can be worse than if you were to go forward. How many times did armies retreat hoping to regroup only to lose? Many theologians, or not theologians, but historians, believed that if the Union Army would have charged the Confederates at Gettysburg instead of just sitting there and letting these people work their way back, they could have actually ended the Civil War there. Because the Confederates were broken. They had no more cannons. They had no more artillery. The effects that they had were very small. And for the 120,000 Union soldiers that were there, they felt that they could have crushed them and ended the Civil War there. But they didn't. And because they didn't, the Civil War went on for another 2 years. You can't go backwards in the process. Because if you go backwards can make it so much harder to come forward again. We've got a lot of people, they go forward, they're uncomfortable with forward, and they go back. Then what happens is when they go back, they decide, well, it's not so bad here, and I don't like what's ahead of me. God's requiring a lot more of me over there. And so what happens is I decide to stay where I'm at. I'm comfortable here. And so what happens is we don't change. And in that change, remember now what Isaiah said, if we don't change and we become comfortable, then we go the opposite direction. And that opposite direction brings us to, he said, broken, cast down, snared. We go backwards. So he told this man here, he said, listen, he said, you've been made well. You've taken your first step, because Peter writes, he said this, he says, and the prayer of the fervent shall save the sick, or shall heal the sick, and if they've done anything wrong, they shall be forgiven. So that prayer, that healing here, Jesus said, you've been healed, you've been delivered. Now, don't sin. You've been forgiven. Go forward. What did Jesus tell people constantly? Take up thy bed and walk. Thy sins be forgiven thee. Go and sin no more. It was a constant, you've made the step, now let's keep going forward. Don't go back. To the woman caught in the act of adultery, he says, neither do I condemn thee, go and sin no more. Don't go back to being an adulteress, go forward. This becomes the next step. This is your first step. Now we've got the next step. And it's a process that as we take a step, I was thinking about it the other day, and I was talking to somebody, and I thought about that woman that was at the well. She had 5 husbands, and the one she had wasn't hers. Jesus talks to her, gets her so excited, she leaves her water pot, she runs in the city, she says, come see a man that has told me everything. Is this not the Messiah? Then Philip comes back, somewhere within a year to a year and a half, and preaches after the day of Pentecost. I wonder where that woman was. The Bible doesn't tell us, but maybe she was on the front row because she heard the name Jesus and she knew that name from the man that talked to her on the well. There's a process. Don't go back to where you came from or what you were delivered from, but move forward. If you go backwards, then what happens is you keep going backwards. If you go forward, you keep getting that momentum to go forward. A little train, I think I can, He had to keep going forward. The last thing he wanted to do was say, well, maybe I need to back down the track and get up some steam to go up over. The problem is you may not get any steam, and you may get the momentum going backwards and not ever recover from it. And there's that going forward. I've got to go forward. So Jesus told this man, he said, listen, you've been delivered, you've been forgiven, now you have to go forward. The woman in the act of adultery, the woman that came in and broke the alabaster box and anointed his feet, you've been forgiven. And he looked to Simon, he said, who loves more? The person forgiven a little or forgiven a lot? Oh, the person forgiven a lot. He looked at her and he says, thy sins be forgiven thee. Now, go forward. No longer are you a person of the night. No longer are you a prostitute. No longer are you've taken the first step. Now you got to go forward. And so Jesus told this to this man. He said, you've been healed. Now this man was the man that was laying at the pool, constantly waiting on the angel to come. Isn't that the way a lot of people are? They're constantly waiting for a certain thing to fall into place. And if it falls into place, I'll get what I want. I've been here. I've been here. I've been here. In fact, if you go up a little bit further, it says, and he had been there for 38 years. I've been there. Oh, if all the stars line up and everything falls into place, everything will just... And the problem is, if all the stars lined up and everything fell into place, they still wouldn't. There was a man we knew many years ago, and he said, when I turn 30, I'm going to get baptized like this, just like Jesus did at 30 years old. And at 30 years old, he still didn't get baptized. And who knows, if he had that same mentality, he may still not be baptized. We wait for everything to line up, and when it does, we go, well, really, this is not a good time for me. Sounds like King Agrippa. Oh, Paul, if things would have been different, if I wasn't a king and didn't have a robe and wasn't on this side and you weren't on that side, maybe I'd consider, but really right now it's not an opportune time. We never heard what happened to King Agrippa, but I'll guarantee you he found himself in the second part of it where he kept going backwards. And so Jesus makes a warning to this man. He says, you've got to go forward. You've got to go forward. And if you go to 1 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter, we're going to start in the 9th verse. It says, for we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, and you are God's building. According to the grace of God which was given to me, a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it. But let each take heed how he builds on it. For there is no other foundation, can be laid than that which was laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, each one's work will become clear, for the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each, but he will receive a reward. I would hate to find myself standing before Christ, and because I built with hay and stubble, it was destroyed. I might make it into heaven, but not get a reward. Because, I had hay and stubble. Kind of like the 3 little pigs. The first one built his house, and the wolf blew it in, and he ran to the next little pig's house, and the wolf blew that one in, and the two of them ran to the third house, and they got in there in the bricks, and of course we know the whole story, But it's sad because he said there's been a foundation laid. Now there's a process. What did Jesus say? Any man who hears my word and follows me is like a man who builds his house upon the rock. And when the storms come, there's a process. The process requires us to walk according to that process. And that process says, we do this, we do this, we do this. There's a process. And as we do that process, what happens is we come to a point that when the storms come, and let's face it, they come to all of us, that the house doesn't collapse. But if we decide we want to build some things a little different. I was listening to history, and Hitler decided he didn't like how the Bible was written. So he decided he was going to rewrite it, and he was going to put in a lot of things that were pro-Aryan. And so he rewrote the Bible. And there were many people, Bonhoeffer, which is someone that Don has read after, he opposed Hitler, but he opposed the rewriting of the scriptures because they took out some of that process and added in other things that weren't a part of the process. And so what happens is that we decide, well, we don't like this, so we're going to redo. But the problem is there's only one foundation, and it's Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ says everything you see is going to pass away. But my word, the foundation, is going to stand. Though heaven and earth pass away, that foundation is still going to be there. It's never going to change. And you've got to build on that foundation. So the process for the other people was, he said they went out and they put their house up on the sand. So what happened? They decided they didn't like the process. Kind of like Hitler when he rewrote the Bible. I don't like the process. I don't like what it says, so we're going to rewrite it and we're going to make it pro-Aryan. Did it change the foundation? No. Did it change the process? No. Was it deceptive? Yes. Because it bypassed the foundation of God. It bypassed the process. It says, well, I can go down here to G and come into the process, and we can get rid of A through F. That's not needed. And then we'll go down here and we'll take S, T, U, V out because they're really not necessary. And then, you know what? M, N, O, we can take that out because that's not necessary. So we get down and we've taken out 10 letters. We've got 16 letters left in the alphabet. And these processes, those processes are built around those. And now that we've got the process, nothing comes out looking right because it's not on the foundation that God has established. Our own pastor, his son, made the statement, well, things have changed in 20 years. And he threw his Bible down and he said, but that hasn't. That's the foundation. That's the foundation. In the process, I have to follow the process of that foundation. Now, if you've ever gone out into construction and you see them out there, And you see this concrete slab sitting there, and they've got these pipes coming up out of the concrete slab. It's because they don't have a basement, so what they do is they put the water pipes, electric pipes, all in the slab. Well, I come in and I decide, well, I don't want the wall there. Oh, so you're going to just have pipes sticking up in the middle of your room. The process says this is where the wall is because that's what the blueprint says. And well, I don't like how the blueprint says it, and I don't like it, so I'm not going to do it. Then when you go over to your sink to turn the water on, you're going to get air. Because the water connection's over there somewhere, capped off, because we don't want water running through the house. It's like, it would be like me going into the house, putting some finishing molding in the house, and I decide to bring my framing nail gun into the house. Donnie hears me, boom, boom, boom. And it puts these great big old nails in there, and it's made for 2x4s and do framing, Come in with finishing work, and you got this little molding, boom, and the molding goes, like you put a bomb in the middle of it and decided just to blow it up. There's a process. There's a special nail gun for molding. There's a special way that you do things. Everything has a process. There's a blueprint that we follow. And no matter what we want, we can't change the blueprint. Because Jesus designed the blueprint. He said, this is what the church is going to look like in the end. And this is how it's got to be. And so we look at that. And we say, wow. I can't imagine when they put up the Twin Towers in New York City, the process that they had to go through to build something that tall. The depth at which they had to put the support down in the ground. The depth and the thickness of the concrete to hold up 110 stories of building. I had the privilege, before it was destroyed, to be on the 110th floor of that building. Well, I don't know whether they would call the observation deck an 111 or not.
I don't know, but if there's no 111, you were there.
Yeah. Well, I was on the observation deck, and you could look out, and you could look and see 3 states. You could see New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey from the top of the building. The first elevator you got in climbed at 66 feet per second, and you were flying. Then you'd get off and you'd go around the corridor and you'd get into another elevator that would take you the rest of the way up. It was called the express elevator. When you got up there, you felt like seeing the doctor somewhere and asking him, could you put my heart back where it belongs? But you got up there and you looked out. But the foundation that had to be laid to build a building that massive, that tall, in that spot. We have to be built on the foundation of Jesus. That's the first process. I can't change that foundation. One of the hard times for the church right now is we're losing all of our old patriarchs that made sure the church was on the foundation. Now it's up to our generation to make sure that we build on the proper foundation. The world can say everything they want to about, well, that's not right. But there's a foundation. Sister Lynn, it has endured the test of time. Sister Donna, it hasn't changed no matter what it went through. What was that one song we used to sing? Been to the storm, the wind couldn't turn it. Fought a lot of wars, but never defeated. Been through the fire, and the fire didn't burn it. All those things. It's the church, triumphant. And it's alive. It's alive and well. The thing is, it's because it's built on the foundation. It's like that house. Jesus said, it's built on the rock. And when the winds come, it doesn't move. When the waves beat against it, it doesn't bend. It stands there. In closing, Donna and I went up to Massachusetts. And we were up there and we saw several lighthouses. But these lighthouses, I can't imagine the force of the waves and the stuff that comes in. There's such a huge, huge force of that water hitting those. And if those lighthouses aren't built strong, they had 2 lighthouses. They were built in 1781. They were twin lighthouses, but I forgot what they called them. But they were 2 lighthouses, and the one was still operational. They were still using. They had gone in and put in the electronics and took out the flame and everything, and the other one wasn't being used. But they were sitting on this island, and there were these 2 lighthouses built in it was either 1781 or 1791. And they were sitting there off of the coast, but they were sitting out in the water. And so for all those years, 250 years, can you imagine the beating that they've taken? And they're still there? They're still there? It was because they were built on the right foundation. Yeah, right. They were built back when someone cared about how they built. But the thing is that they're still there. Because they were built on the right foundation. And this church, not just us, the church of God, will remain as long as it's built on the right foundation. And those that aren't, they follow the second thing. He says, and it'll be precept on precept and precept on precept, line upon line, here a little, there a little, until they are broken, snared, caught. How did we get here? You didn't follow the process. How did we lose everything? You didn't build on the right foundation. A story that we've all heard, Reader's Digest story. A man that was wealthy wanted this house to be built. He wanted no cost or expenses to be an issue. He called his friend in and told him to build this house. He was going on a trip to Europe, and when he got back, he wanted to take possession. And so they're building the houses, and it had 2x6s in the walls, and he thought, we could do 2x4s in the interior walls, that's acceptable. Wasn't according to the blueprints, but it was acceptable. Instead of using 3/4 sheetrock, we could use 5/8. That's to code. We don't have to do all of this expense and everything else. We can, quote unquote, cut corners, but keep it in the code. The man got back and he said, you've been my best friend for many years. And I've always wanted to do something for you. And he turned around and handed the key back to the man, and he says, I had this house built for you. I wonder how many times he laid there in that house and looked up and said, you know, that could be 3/4 drywall up there instead of 5/8. I could have had number 12 wiring in the wall instead of number 15. I could have had 2x4 or 2x6 studs instead of 2x4. There's a process. We've got to follow and we've got to trust the process. If we don't trust the process, then what happens is we find ourselves just like the rest of the world going, what happened? What took place? Why am I here? Why am I an outcast? And I'm not talking about an outcast in a good way. I have a feeling Paul and Peter and some of the other apostles were probably considered outcasts. But they were an outcast because of the gospel and because of the Word of God that was in them. But how did we get here? How did we find ourselves in this place? Almost sounds like the 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins. The 5 foolish virgins says, we don't have any. How did we get here? He said, you got to follow the process. If you don't understand, the process will take you to a place you don't want to go. And you'll be caught and you'll be broken and you'll be... But if you follow the process, it brings rest, it brings comfort, it brings peace, and at the end, you can stand before God with your head up. You can be like Paul. Paul said, Timothy, I have fought a good fight. I have kept the faith and I have finished my course, and I am now ready to be offered up. I'm ready to be offered up. Following the process. Trusting in the process. We've got to do that. Let's stand.